This is Module 1, Introducing the Training and Understanding ATT&CK. Welcome to Using MITRE ATT&CK for Cyber Threat Intelligence Training. My name is Katie Nichols. I'm the Threat Intelligence Lead for the MITRE ATT&CK team, and I'll be joined in a few minutes by my teammate Adam Pennington. We'll be presenting this training to you in 5 modules today. We're really pleased you could join us. And before we get started, we wanted to just take a moment to talk about what is this thing called cyber threat intelligence, since it's commonly misunderstood. The definition that we like of cyber threat intelligence comes from Sergio Caltagirone in a paper that he wrote on ICS threat intelligence. That definition is, threat intelligence is actionable knowledge and insight on adversaries and their malicious activities, enabling defenders and their organizations to reduce harm through better security decision-making. Love that definition from Sergio, and the only addition I would have to that is, it's actionable knowledge and insight, but it's also the process of doing that. So from that definition, we're going to be talking about how ATT&CK is useful for cyber threat intelligence. And while we'll arm you with the tools and process to do this, you'll still have some work to do in your own organizations. With that, let's start out with an overview of what you can expect in this training. The training consists of 5 modules, and each of those modules has a mix of videos and exercises. You can find everything at attack.mitre.org/training/CTI. We're currently in Module 1, where I'm introducing the training to you, and then I'll shortly be passing it off to Adam to give you an overview of what ATT&CK is and how you can use it for cyber threat intel. Module 1 is just a video for you. In Module 2, we'll be moving on, explaining how to map to ATT&CK from finished reporting. We'll have a video for you, and we'll introduce the topic to you, then recommend you pause the exercise and pull down the materials on that training page available at attack.mitre.org/training/CTI. We'll do this in each of our modules, where we'll tell you when to pause and about how long we recommend you pause for to complete that exercise. Now, this training is designed to be completed in about 4 hours when we've done it in person, but of course, take as much time as you need to do those exercises. After you pause the video to do the exercise, then we'll recommend you keep playing it for us to go over the exercise. In Module 3, we'll be teaching you how to map to ATT&CK from raw data. Again, we'll start with a topic introduction video, have an exercise for you, and then go over that exercise. In Module 4, very similar idea, we'll be talking about storing and analyzing ATT&CK mapped intel, starting with a topic introduction video, including an ATT&CK Navigator overview and demo. Then we'll give you an exercise where you'll compare layers using ATT&CK Navigator, and we'll go over that exercise as well. Lastly, in Module 5, we'll talk about how you can make that ATT&CK map data actionable by making defensive recommendations, starting with a topic introduction video, moving on to exercise 5, where you'll make some defensive recommendations yourself, and then go over that exercise and wrap up. That's an overview of what you can expect throughout this training. Those 5 modules map to this process of applying ATT&CK to cyber threat intel, and our goal for this training is that you'll leave understanding each of these areas. Here in Module 1, we're focusing on understanding ATT&CK, what it is, how it's useful for cyber threat intelligence. Modules 2 and 3 will focus on mapping data to ATT&CK. How do we do that from finished reporting or from raw data? What are some of the challenges of that and the differences between those 2 types of mapping? In Module 4, we'll talk about storing and analyzing ATT&CK mapped data, and then Module 5, we'll be putting that into action, explaining how you can make those defensive recommendations from that data you've so carefully mapped to ATT&CK. That's an overview of what we'll be doing throughout this training, and I'm now going to pass it off to Adam to introduce you to ATT&CK and how it's useful for cyber threat intelligence.
Thank you, Katie. Before you start working with ATT&CK, we wanted to make sure that everyone's on the same page and give you an idea of what ATT&CK is, isn't, and some of the pieces that actually make up ATT&CK. So as we dive into what ATT&CK is, we'd like to start with some of the problems it helps solve. We'll never get to 100% answers on any of these, but ATT&CK can help us address a number of these problems. For example, how effective are my defenses? It's tough to know if our defenses are working since we aren't sure if adversaries are in our network or not. Perhaps we're being asked, would I be able to detect APT-29 if they're in my network or some other adversary in the news? Is the data I'm collecting useful? Am I collecting the right sorts of information to be able to detect the behaviors that I really care about? Do I have overlapping tool coverage? Have I got a number of things that are looking for the exact same behaviors, or am I spread out over the things I care about? Evaluating whether some new product I'm considering helps my organization's defenses. Will it actually cover the behaviors I'm really worried about? So what is ATT&CK? Simply stated, it's a knowledge base of adversary behaviors. It's a framework that brings together a lot of various things that adversaries do. It's like an encyclopedia of different activities from bad actors. ATT&CK is based on real-world observations. It's based on what adversaries have done in the past or what they're likely doing. It's not meant to include theoretical, proof of concept, or red team only attacks, but rather focus on what real adversaries are done because there's a lot of value in prioritizing those behaviors. ATT&CK is free, open, and globally accessible. Anyone can use ATT&CK, anyone from students to corporations to individual defenders, and anyone worldwide can make use of it. ATT&CK provides a common language that different teams and organizations can use to make sure that they're on the same page. Different teams often use different terms to describe the same behavior. With ATT&CK, they can point to a common resource. Lastly, ATT&CK is community-driven. The majority of behaviors that are being added to ATT&CK today are being contributed by people like you in the community, letting us know actions that adversaries are doing that we should be tracking. In explaining the space that ATT&CK lives in, we often like to use the Pyramid of Pain by David Bianco. This describes how some activities are much harder for adversaries to change that defenders might detect in an environment than others. So we start with things like hash values at the bottom. Adding a single bit to a file is really easy for an adversary, but completely changes the hash that a defender might see. Working up through the various levels, things like IP addresses, domain names, the things that an adversary would have to maybe buy a new one or provision new infrastructure, but they're still fairly simple, easy for somebody to get around. As we get up to an adversary having to retool or change what their network protocols look like, this starts to get a lot more challenging for an adversary. Moving up to the top of the pyramid, we get to where we think it's most painful for adversaries to change. This is tactics, techniques, and procedures or behaviors. And this is the space that ATT&CK lives in. Adversaries are humans too. Just like us, they're creatures of habit. They have routines. So just like you and I might have a routine in the morning where we get up, we get dressed, we have breakfast, we go to work. If somebody told us tomorrow that we had to take a different route to work or eat something that we're not used to or find a new way to get dressed, that's going to be a lot harder for us and disrupt our day. And so it can be a place that adversaries are set in the same behaviors over and over again. And it can be a really great place to catch adversaries. So if you've seen ATT&CK before, this might be the view that you might be used to seeing, what we call the matrix. Across this matrix, we've got a set of columns. And at the top of these, we have what we call tactics. These are the adversary's high-level technical goals. So these are things like initial access. The adversary is trying to get into my network initially. Lateral movement, an adversary is trying to get between different systems in my environment. Or something like impact, where an adversary is trying to destroy or disrupt parts of my enterprise. Down each of these columns, we have techniques, which are more detailed ways of how these goals are actually achieved. So instead of initial access, we have things like spear phishing attachment or spear phishing link. Instead of impact, we have data destruction or data encrypted for impact. So getting into more specifics of how the adversary is actually accomplishing these high-level tactic goals. So if you're used to tactics, techniques, you might be expecting next procedures. So behind each of these techniques is a lot more information, including these procedure examples. So instead of just how the goals are achieved, these are specific ways that specific adversaries have actually accomplished these goals. So instead of spear phishing attachment, we have that APT&CK sent spear phishing emails with attachments in RTF and Excel with macros to deliver their initial exploits. So I talked about a lot more detail being behind each of these techniques. I'm going to walk through what's actually in each technique with an attack. Each technique starts with a text description that describes what the activity is, why the adversary might be doing it, and various levels of technical detail of how that technique can actually be done. Each technique also includes metadata. So it starts with a technique ID. So when I talked about attack as a communication mechanism, so you can use it where you're talking about spear phishing attachment, and we all mean the same thing. But a lot of people just use these technique IDs as a short form for describing the activity. So instead of spear phishing attachment, I could say T1193. Each technique has which tactic it's in, or multiple tactics. In this case, initial access. Which platforms the technique is applicable to. And so this is either operating systems, things like different types of cloud platforms, basically where you'd have to be for that activity to be seen. We have data sources. And so these are the different things that would be useful to gather to potentially see this technique being done. And then we have different pieces of metadata that vary based on which tactic we're in. We have mitigations. So these are different ways that you could actually prevent the technique from taking place in the first place or turning into malicious activity. Each of these mitigations are clickable. You can get a greater description of what's actually behind them and some of the other techniques you might be able to stop by implementing a particular mitigation. We've got detections. So these are different ways that you might actually be able to see this activity if it was happening in your environment. We again have those procedure examples, and so these are what I talked about before as the specific examples of how specific actors have done these techniques. And all of that information is referenced. You can go back to the original open source public threat intelligence reports that all of this information came from and verify that you agree with us on that actual activity being associated with that actor. So similar to the technique pages, we have group pages. Each of these describes a specific threat group. So similar to the techniques, there's a short text description describing the group, all of this cited back to open source threat intelligence reporting. There's metadata associated with the group, and it's a group ID similar to a technique ID. One of the things that people find really useful with an attack is our associated group descriptions. Lots of different companies have their own names and their own group descriptions for describing overlapping threat group activity. So where one company might call a grouping of activity APT29, another might call it the Dukes. And so this may not be 100% overlapping, but it's still related activity. And so we try to keep track of these related names, all cited back to the reports that they come from. The flip side of the procedure examples from techniques, we have the techniques used by each of these groups, and so this is the same information that appears on the techniques pages. Again, all cited back. And we have pages very similar to the groups on pieces of software that different groups use. And so these are pieces of software that have been seen to be used by each of these groups in open source public reporting, along with the techniques that each of those pieces of software could do. And again, we list all of our references within each group so that you can go back and check our work and see if you agree with what we're saying about them. So I've explained a bit about what attack is, but how can you actually use it? There are 4 key use cases we've seen with attack, but there are others. First off, detection. This is arguably the most common use case we see with attack. Attack can be a way to map out your detections, often in the form of behavioral analytics, and see what your organization is actually able to track. Attack provides a structured way to actually keep track of all of these so you can measure where your gaps are and work to improve. Another use case is threat intelligence. You can track what techniques your adversaries use, track the adversaries you care about, compare between different adversary groups, and compare a single adversary group over time. Next up is assessment and engineering. As you're mapping your detections to attack, you can start to assess where your gaps are and where you need to improve. Taking that knowledge, you can then figure out where it is you want to make your investments for future engineering and your defenses, and how to improve them over time. Lastly, we have adversary emulation. This is a specific type of red teaming that focuses on emulating a specific adversary or group of adversaries. ATT&CK provides a structure where a red team can lay out their operations, figure out what behaviors they're going to do, and it can also be a way for red and blue to communicate the activities that they see and what were done. This is actually the original use case that ATT&CK was created for. So I've talked about the various use cases we see people using with ATT&CK, but today we're focused specifically on cyber threat intelligence. So over the next 4 modules, we're going to talk about various ways that you can work with cyber threat intelligence using ATT&CK, but wanted to cover some high-level ways that ATT&CK can help. One of the big things it can do is allow you to use your knowledge of adversary behaviors to inform defenders. All the various resources that are in ATT&CK itself and the other resources that refer back to ATT&CK can let you make your intelligence actionable. It also allows you to do a number of things if you're structuring your threat intelligence with ATT&CK. So Katie's going to be getting into this more in Module 4, but allows you to compare behaviors. You can compare various groups to each other, you can compare groups over time, and you can compare groups to what you're actually defending against today. And as we mentioned before, it also allows you to communicate in a common language. As a cyber threat intelligence analyst, it can let us go from saying, the adversary's doing this, they've got a run key, it's Adobe Updater, where we might not know exactly what they're talking about. If they're using a language of ATT&CK and they're saying, it's registry run keys, startup folder, T1060, our defender has something that they can go, they can look it up, they can see that they have the right data sources to detect it and know that they're safe. It can also serve as a way to communicate across the community. So if company 1 is saying today, APT Elite is using auto run, and company B is saying Fuzzy Duck used a run key, if they use ATT&CK, they can speak the same language, both say adversaries using registry run keys, 1060, and the consumer understands what they're talking about and speaking all the same language. So I've just taught some of the basics of ATT&CK, what it is, a little bit about how it works with cyber threat intelligence, and so hopefully you now have a better idea and understand ATT&CK. The next module, Katie's going to be talking about how you can actually start to turn your finished threat intelligence reporting into the language of ATT&CK. This is the end of Module 1.